From ABC, this is World News Tonight with Peter Jennings.
Good evening. The political focus of the Persian Gulf War has shifted tonight to Moscow. The Iraqi Foreign Minister Tariq Aziz flew to the Soviet capital this afternoon to meet with Mikhail Gorbachev and give him Saddam Hussein's answer about withdrawing unconditionally from Kuwait. Already today, Saddam Hussein has been on the radio with a very mixed message about his intentions. We have no other way of continuing, he told the Iraqi people, which sounded like he was about to cave in. But he also said the mother of battles will be our battle of victory and martyrdom, which sounded like he was about to fight on. In Washington earlier, the White House said that the Iraqi leader's speech didn't make any contribution to solving the problem. But right now, the president and all his aides are as anxious as the rest of us to know what is going on in the Kremlin, which is where we begin. In Moscow, ABC's Jim Lordy.
Aboard a special Soviet plane, the Iraqi foreign minister arrived back here on a mission the Soviets have said is the last chance to avoid a ground war. Tariq Aziz said nothing before being driven away at midnight in Moscow to the Kremlin, where President Gorbachev was waiting. Before the two men met, Soviet officials said they hoped for a clear-cut response. If there are any ifs, ands, and buts, said one official, then it means a certain land war. Gorbachev and Tariq Aziz have met now for more than 2 hours. No details of the talks have emerged. Here at the Foreign Press Center in Moscow, a briefing is scheduled within the next hour, and further meetings are scheduled here tomorrow with the Soviet foreign minister. The mood going into these talks was very pessimistic. Peter?
Jim, I'm going to ask you, because we can see people waiting there for Mr. Gorbachev's spokesman to come out and talk to the foreign press, whether you could go a little farther and tell us what you mean by pessimistic.
Well, on the one hand, the foreign minister said going into this, Mr. Mernik said we should not give up hope until there is no hope at all. But on the other hand, one Soviet diplomat tonight called the speech of Saddam Hussein a kamikaze message which would destroy the Iraqi people. The pessimism came about, of course, after the speech on radio of Saddam Hussein, which was monitored here in Moscow, and the counts were broadcast on Soviet radio and television.
Okay, Jim Lorry, thanks very much. One of the people who went to Moscow today was the Iraqi ambassador to the United Nations, and we have wondered whether there was some sort of clue there. Joining us tonight from the State Department is our national security correspondent, John McWethy. John, talk a little, if you know anything down there today, about Iraqi strategy.
Well, it appears by sending their United Nations ambassador to Moscow that the Iraqis are planning on a rather long and detailed discussion with the Soviets. That may be good news, it may be bad news, depending on what side you're on here. But the United States is concerned that this could be a protracted and long negotiation, which is not, of course, the kind of message that George Bush wants. He wants a very clean-cut, very clear message with Saddam Hussein saying, okay, I give.
On the other hand, John, President Bush went to war with the full blessing of the United Nations Security Council. Why would there be any resistance to going back to the Security Council to try to resolve it now?
Well, not necessarily resistance, Peter. I think what the Bush administration would be concerned about is throwing this back into the Security Council before it has been decided exactly how this war is going to end. It is, after all, just a few members of the Security Council that are involved in actually fighting the war, and the United States has been stressing to the Soviets, if you're not involved in this war, fine, you can help us settle it. But as far as we're concerned, the coalition partners, those that are actually fighting, are going to be the ones that are going to have a major say in this.
Okay, John McWethy at the State Department, thank you. Let's go back to the speech now. This morning's speech was Saddam Hussein's third since the war began, and each time there were expectations he would announce a major shift in policy. Each time he did not. Today he spoke for 40 minutes. It's still very difficult to figure out his intentions. ABC's Bill Blakemore listened to it in Baghdad, and his report, as usual, was cleared by the Iraqi censors.
Shortly before the Baghdad radio broadcast, Iraqi officials released this silent footage of President Saddam Hussein meeting last night with Foreign Minister Tariq Aziz and other members of his Revolutionary Command Council. Then, just after sunset tonight, journalists and translators gathered around radios here in the Al Rashid Hotel to hear Saddam Hussein make a speech directed at least as much to the Iraqi people as to any foreign listeners, and which reviewed the history of this conflict. He complained repeatedly that when he sent a signal last week that he was ready to withdraw, the Allies kept adding more conditions. And he said if his current response, which Tariq Aziz is carrying to Moscow, is rejected, it will prove America does not want peace, but only to destroy Iraq. The speech could be read here as preparing Iraqis for the current diplomatic efforts to go either way. Saddam Hussein seemed to be saying that if his forces withdraw from Kuwait, it will not be capitulation or surrender. And he said if his response to Moscow is rejected by the Allies, his soldiers will be ready to fight even harder. Barely more than an hour after the speech, there were more Allied air raids over Baghdad. Whatever people in Baghdad may be speculating about Saddam Hussein's message to Moscow and the Allied response, for people in this capital tonight, the war is still on. Bill Blakemore, ABC News, in Baghdad.
As we said, the Soviet spokesman Vitaly Ignatenko is in Moscow now, just briefing the press, the beginning of the briefing on the press of what is going on. We've only managed to pick up a couple of words from him so far, but he has said the first response in the Kremlin to the visit of Tariq Aziz is positive. We'll monitor this as it goes along. He's speaking in Russian, and we'll keep you up to date just almost minute by minute. Let's go on a little bit talking about the speech, because it's been the defining thing by which people have made early judgments today. The White House announced its verdict early on that nothing there to stop the war. At the White House tonight, ABC's Brit Hume. Brit, there has been some feeling today that perhaps President Bush has been moving the goalposts on Saddam Hussein, that he doesn't want the war to stop, and he keeps adding on conditions.
Well, Peter, the officials here at the White House, and indeed including the President himself, I'm confident would argue that the UN resolutions go beyond simply the one calling for withdrawal of Kuwait from Kuwait, and discuss the prospects for peace in the region, stability in the region, and that some specifics must be required to bring that about, and indeed specific conditions would need to be agreed upon and established to bring about the withdrawal itself. So any of these criteria that the White House has discussed, which could be an answer to any acceptance of the Soviet offer, would be along those lines, and the White House would argue vigorously, Peter, that it is all under the UN resolutions.
I guess what I'm trying to get at, Britt, is the feeling in a lot of people's mind that they are determined in the White House now to have Saddam Hussein out of Kuwait and out of power altogether, and that the President just doesn't want to accept him simply leaving Kuwait and leaving him in power.
Well, I think obviously out of Kuwait is something the White House feels confident it can bring about one way or another. Out of power is something the White House would very much like. The President has indicated as much. But it is something officials here tell me they're not at all sure they can bring about. And indeed, in the last couple of days, officials have been going out of their way to say, we've always assumed, always presumed all along that in the end he would still be there and we would have to deal with him. Indeed, they suggest this is one of the reasons why they want to be so careful about how these resolutions are carried out, how careful about how the withdrawal is carried out, so that he doesn't still have a massive set of armaments behind him.
Okay, Brit Hume, thanks very much at the White House. To give you some idea of how complicated this all is, we've talked to a score of people today who've heard or read Saddam Hussein's speech. Some detect ambiguity. Others think he was giving up. Still others think that he meant to keep on fighting. So let's go back to Moscow now, to ABC's Jim Laurie. Sorry, Bill Quant, we'll get to you in a minute. Let's go back to Moscow, where Jim Laurie has been listening to the Soviet spokesman. Jim, can you tell us what he is saying? Well, he's applauding, so what does that mean? All right, Jim Laurie is in Moscow at the moment. He has just been listening to Vitaly Ignatenko, who is Mr. Gorbachev's personal spokesman. Let's just see if we can listen here.
Response was positive.
Все. Большое вам спасибо.
Is that all? I thank you.
Спокойной ночи.
And a good night.
Well, as I said, we will do our very best to get you the details now of what Mr. Ignatenko has said. But it is pretty unusual to have a presidential spokesman applaud, even a Russian sometimes applaud the audience at the end of a briefing. So let's again try for Jim Laurie in Moscow and some of the details. Jim.
Yes, Peter, it is a complicated 8 or 9 point program that has been agreed upon by the Soviets and the Iraqis. Point 1 states that the Iraqis will withdraw from Kuwait unconditionally. Point 2, the withdrawal after the second day, which will occur on the second day after a cessation of hostility. Point 3, after 2/3 of the forces have been withdrawn from Kuwait, economic sanctions against Iraq would cease. Point 4, after the end of the withdrawal, all resolutions passed by the UN Security Council would cease to be in effect. Part 5, under the ceasefire period, all POWs, all prisoners of war, would be immediately released on both sides. The next point involves the monitoring of this withdrawal. It would be monitored by a force of chosen by the UN, those that were not members of the original anti-Iraq coalition. And the final point involves the details still to be worked out, which, according to the spokesman for President Gorbachev, these details would be worked out and submitted to the Security Council during the day tomorrow. Peter?
Okay, Jim, just stand by with us for a second, because I think probably the most sensible thing we can do here is to try to work down some of these conditions so that we can give them all to you at home. And I don't doubt for a second that this is the first time a lot of politicians around the world have been hearing this, though it's conceivable, as in the past, that the Soviets have already briefed the White House. But let us go to our national security correspondent, John McWethy, again. John, just take the first couple there, that the Iraqis have agreed to withdraw unconditionally from Kuwait, and on the second day after a ceasefire. How do you think that'll play in Washington?
Well, one of the things that the Bush administration has been pushing is an immediate and rapid withdrawal. What appears to be missing here is how soon are all Iraqi forces going to be out of Kuwait. The Bush administration wanted all of them out in just 4 or 5 days. There does not appear to be any such timeline in this one.
But as you listen to those 9 points that Jim Laurie put forward for Moscow, do you have any doubt in your mind that Saddam Hussein wants to withdraw from Kuwait?
This is a very serious proposal. There are going to be many objections raised by the coalition, by the United States, but this is a very serious proposal. They are saying they're going to get out, and this is the first time that they appear to be doing it in this kind of terms.
Okay, let me go over to the White House where Britt Hume is standing by, and Britt, ask you, because you monitor the White House's temperature almost hourly now, whether you see anything there which is going to cause instant rejection by the Bush administration.
Yes, I do, Peter. The proposal, if that's what it is, and if the Soviets have agreed to it, I think it's going to come as a great disappointment to the Bush administration. For one thing, the withdrawal appears then to vitiate or wipe out all the other UN resolutions. The administration and the president himself have been quite firm all along that Saddam Hussein must adhere to all UN resolutions and not just the one that calls for him to withdraw from Kuwait. So on that point alone, Peter, I would think that as far as the White House is concerned, this proposal fails.
Fails, or is perhaps just another stop along the road, Britt?
Well, in the sense that obviously, because the United States is the leader of the coalition of forces that is on one side of this war, it must accept any proposal that purports to end the war, and I don't guess that this is going to be acceptable and that something better will have to come up, or in my estimation the war will go on.
Okay, but I think we're all going to go away for a second. I'll think about this for a minute, but let me just ask you one more question. Here is Saddam Hussein saying that he is prepared to withdraw. He's prepared to withdraw 2 days after a ceasefire. He talks about having X number of forces out. Is that something which the Bush administration can just reject out of hand?
Well, I think that the Bush administration may be encouraged that Saddam Hussein is now willing to carry out the step of withdrawal from Kuwait, but it is very concerned, as one official put it to me here yesterday, that it not lose the game in the ninth inning. The feeling here is that the Allied forces are way ahead in this conflict, that Saddam Hussein and his forces are in terrible military trouble, and that a ground war, while it would incur some casualties, would be won, and perhaps handily, by the Allies, and they would be in a position to have this war and this conflict and this crisis end on terms acceptable to the coalition. I don't think they will readily surrender that position in favor of something that does not observe all the UN resolutions by which the president has been guided for so long.
Okay, we'll come back to this in a minute, but as Britt makes the point, perhaps one of the reasons Saddam Hussein has said he will withdraw his forces from Kuwait is because he understands how far ahead in the game, as some people call it, the coalition forces are. We'll be back in just a minute.
This is World News Tonight with Peter Jennings, brought to you by Dairy Ease.
When 1 in 4 adults looks at dairy food, their stomach says stop. Say no now or pay later. Antacids aren't made for this problem. called lactose intolerance. But new Dairy Ease is. It's not an antacid, but a natural nutritional supplement that helps comfortable digestion of ice cream, cheese, and milk. Now enjoy dairy food as naturally as everyone else with pleasant-tasting, chewable new Dairy Ease.
A few small towns in western Pennsylvania have produced more football legends than any other place. Dan Marino, Johnny Unitas, George Blanda. What is it about these towns that gives birth to such greatness? The very things that drive us at Ford. When leadership is in your blood, you push yourself to even greater heights. In fact, starting right now, you'll be seeing more new models and exciting innovations from Ford than you've seen in years. Ford Motor Company.
We are going to come back to this we think it's 9-point proposal which the Iraqis and the Soviets have agreed on, announced in Moscow a short while ago, and talk about it, but so that we get it absolutely clear for you to understand it, we'll take a few minutes. In the meantime, let's go to the war itself. Today, a U.S. helicopter was shot down. Its 2 pilots were killed. Another helicopter, this one a medical evacuation chopper, crashed during bad weather in Saudi Arabia, and all 7 Americans on board were killed. On this 36th day of the war, weather has affected the overall operations, which has meant more artillery and fewer fighter planes operating. Our nightly report from there, ABC's Bill Rediker.
Some of the worst weather since the war began forced the cancellation of about 20% of today's air combat missions, and many pilots who did fly had to return to base without dropping their bombs.
Every minute we're stuck on the ground is a minute their troops are moving, preparing, waiting.
The inability to see and destroy targets, such as attack helicopters hidden by the Iraqis, may be a factor in determining when a ground battle could be launched.
What we're trying to do is to ensure that if and when a ground battle does begin, that there is as little as possible harassment from the air against our ground troops.
The British have also been aiming for ammunition dumps. This nose camera video shows 2 different strikes. The first against an empty storage area. The second against one apparently full of explosives.
Oh dear, that went up. Yeehaw.
But officers warn the Iraqis have a lot of ammunition left.
There are tens of thousands of tons of ammunition in Iraq. So, you know, this is not a matter of getting anywhere near destroying all his stocks.
The biggest Allied artillery barrage of the war was launched today. The U.S. Army's 1st Armored Division, along with the 1st Cavalry Division, joined 72 British howitzers and 12 multiple rocket launchers. There was no return fire. Soldiers said as far as they were concerned, their part of the ground war has begun.
The ground war is certainly underway. The artillery of all the allies is engaging the Iraqis on the ground.
Still, American military officers said today U.S. ground forces so far have crossed the border only for reconnaissance purposes. The damage, if any, from today's massive artillery barrage will be difficult to assess. Unlike pilots, artillery gunners cannot see their target, and by the time reconnaissance planes photograph the area, Iraqi forces have usually moved. Bill Rediker, ABC News, Saudi Arabia.
The war report for today. Now, we want to bring the entire ABC network all across the country up to speed on what has been happening in Moscow. In order to do that, we're going to break away from World News Tonight, pause for just a second, and come back with a special report. So I hope you'll stay with us.
This is an ABC News special report on the Gulf War. Reporting from New York, Peter Jennings.
There have been major political developments on the Persian Gulf War in Moscow today. As you know, the Soviet leader Mikhail Gorbachev has been meeting with the Iraqi Foreign Minister Tariq Aziz, who flew there today after Saddam Hussein had made this major speech on radio, which no one fully understood. But after several hours of meetings in the Kremlin between Tariq Aziz and Mikhail Gorbachev, they have come to make some kind of a presentation to the United States and the rest of the coalition, in fact, to the whole world. Vitaly Ignatenko is Mr. Gorbachev's personal spokesman. He came to a briefing room in the Kremlin just a few 2 minutes ago and listed the points on which the Soviets and the Iraqis have either agreed, or at least the ones they want to put forward. So here are those points as put forward by Mr. Ignatenko.
First,
Iraq
states about its full and unconditional withdrawal of its forces from Kuwait. Second, the withdrawal of forces begins on the second day after the cessation of hostilities. The withdrawal of forces will take place in a fixed time frame. Fourth, after the withdrawal of 2/3 of all the forces, Iraqi forces from Kuwait, the economic sanctions envisaged by the UN will cease to apply to Iraq. Fifth, after the end of the withdrawal of Iraqi forces from Kuwait, thus the causes would cease to exist, the causes for the corresponding resolutions of the Security Council. So thus those resolutions would cease to be in effect. Sixth, right after the ceasefire, all the POWs will be immediately released. Seventh, the withdrawal of forces would be monitored by the countries not directly involved in the conflict, being so entrusted by the Security Council of the United Nations. And last point, the work on determining the details and specifications continues. The final outcome of this work will be made public today, on the 22nd of February, till the countries members, present members of the Security Council of the United Nations. This is what I had to say about the work conducted today. So I do think that I can say a very...
Vitaly Ignatenko, Mr. Gorbachev's personal spokesman in Moscow just a short while ago, putting forward a number of either proposals or agreements that the Iraqis and the Soviets appear to have come together on. Let me just run down them and then ask some people around the network to comment on them. An unconditional withdrawal of Iraqi forces to begin on the second day after the ceasefire begins, after the cessation of hostilities. The withdrawal to occur within a fixed time frame. After 2/3 of the Iraqi forces are out, economic sanctions will cease. All UN resolutions to be declared null and void following complete withdrawal. That on the surface of it will cause some complications in Washington, but we're not quite sure what they'll be over the longer term. All prisoners of war released after the ceasefire, and the withdrawal to be monitored by uninvolved nations supervised by the UN. By uninvolved, I think the Iraqis mean they're nations which are not members of the Allied coalition, which are aligned against it. Let us get the... Oh, by the way, I must tell you also that Mr. Gorbachev has phoned Mr. Bush with this information, but it may be a bit early to get a full and formal reaction from the White House, but let's try. ABC's Britt Hume is standing by. Britt.
Well, Peter, it occurs to me that given the President's insistence all along that all UN resolutions be adhered to and that Iraq withdraw unconditionally and immediately, that the administration will immediately find fault with this proposal on a couple of grounds. One of them being that all the UN resolutions would be vitiated, apparently, after 2/3 of Iraq's forces are out of Kuwait, or at least upon the withdrawal, and that the economic sanctions would be withdrawn with 1/3 of Iraq's forces still in Kuwait. So I think I see a basis upon which there might be real objections here. It does occur to me, Peter, though, that this is a more attractive offer than Iraq made last Friday, and that the president was able to knock that one aside pretty easily. This one might be more difficult for him to get all the coalition partners on board with in terms of his attitude, but I suspect that he'll not be favorably disposed toward this.
Okay, Britt Hume, I know that Marlon Fitzwater, the president's spokesman, was listening to Mr. Ignatenko and dashed off to the Oval Office, so we'll keep monitoring the White House as readily as we can. Let's go to the State Department, where ABC's John McCarthy is standing by. John, a first reaction.
The first reaction is that if the president is going to try to prosecute the ground war now, I think that is going to be extremely difficult. I would think with an offer like this on the table from the Iraqis, the ground war is off. So that would probably be a first off-the-top sort of thing. Secondly, I think there are going to be some objections on the part of the coalition. There has been no announcement of what a specific timetable for withdrawal is going to be, although within that announcement, Mr. Ignatenko said there will be a fixed period, but it apparently has not been determined, or at least has not been announced.
Let me stop you there for a sec, John.
Sure, go ahead.
To talk about this fixed time frame. In the Washington Post today, there were a number of conditions which the president apparently wanted to add on, not the least of which was that all Iraqi forces should get out of Kuwait in 4 days. How on earth would that even be possible?
It would be possible if they climbed out of their tanks and headed for the border on whatever kind of transport they could find. That is what the Bush administration in an ideal world would like, and that would force them to leave all of their artillery and all of their tanks behind. Clearly, Saddam Hussein, in making his offer, is trying to preserve his military, what's left of it, and be able to have enough time to safely drive them back across the border.
Now, you cover Secretary of State Baker, who's been deeply involved in the relations between the U.S. and the Soviets on this. Let me try a couple more on you and get his thinking, which I gather can sometimes be shaded slightly different than the White House. After two-thirds of forces out, economic sanctions cease to exist. Been any thought about that in Washington until now?
Well, all I can tell you is that James Baker is an extremely careful lawyer, and he would, of course, say there is never any daylight between himself and the president, although there have been apparent shadings of differences on all of this. He is going to take apart these 7 or 8 points bit by bit and come back at the Soviets guaranteed.
Okay. The withdrawal of all forces monitored by nations that are not part of the international coalition seems to make sense from an Iraqi point of view.
Oh, absolutely. And from the United States point of view as well, there would be an air of legitimacy there whereby none of the combatants are involved in trying to establish a peacekeeping force. That's very standard procedure in this sort of thing, where you have two very hostile forces, very hot fighting going on. You try to separate them first of all and interject people who have no vested interest.
Okay, stand by if you wouldn't mind for a minute, John McCarthy. I want to bring in Bill Quandt here, who is the Middle East analyst at the Brookings Institution, who has been through this with us all today, listening to Saddam Hussein. Having listened to the speech this morning and now seeing these proposals laid out, these 8 or 9 proposals, what's your first reaction?
Well, Saddam Hussein said in the speech earlier in the day that he wasn't going to capitulate, and I think the response that we're seeing is his way of saying that Iraq may agree to withdraw, but it has certain conditions. The ones that I think are most important to Iraq is that the sanctions come off immediately and Iraq not be held liable for reparations when this is all over with. And those are precisely the conditions that are going to be most difficult, I think, for the United States to accept. In fact, I think they will not accept them.
I must tell you that when the question of UN Resolution 664, which talks about Iraq paying reparations to the Kuwaitis, paying for damages done to Kuwait, we immediately farmed it out to a group of international lawyers and came back with a split decision. So that's another one of the UN resolutions, which, as Bill Quandt and earlier Britt Hume has said, is going to get a political interpretation on it as much as a legal interpretation at the moment. Over at the Pentagon, standing by with some comments, ABC's Bob Zelnick. Bob.
Peter, there are a couple of other things about these conditions that may be difficult for the United States to accept. Number one, there has been resistance all along to a ceasefire before the withdrawal begins, and certainly for a couple of days. I think there continues to be fear that Iraq could use that period to resupply its forces. Secondly, I would disagree, at least from the Pentagon's perspective, with Jack's comment that it will be acceptable or likely be acceptable to have supervision by parties not involved in the fighting. It was reliably reported to me just within the past hour that the Secretary of Defense and others in the administration do not like the fact that after the United States and its allies spent their treasure and spent several lives conducting this war, that the Iraqis are in fact surrendering to the Russians, and there will be resistance to a withdrawal that is supervised by others, although after that withdrawal occurs, there will be room for a UN observer force or other international body.
Bob, let me stop you there for a
Yes,
second,
sir.
because you've said something I don't want us to lose sight of here. You've talked about people sacrificing lives. I'd like to ask you, and then Jack McQuethy, and then Brit Hume, about the larger picture here. Saddam Hussein has apparently said to the Soviets that he is prepared to withdraw all of his troops from Kuwait. If he's prepared to withdraw all of his troops from Kuwait, seemingly American soldiers and men of other services don't go and have to risk dying in a war. Is that not the larger question here?
I think it is to many military leaders, Peter, and I think that it will have influence on what happens now. For example, the United States will make known its objections, but I've been told within the last several minutes that while the bombing campaign will continue, the air war will continue, it is very, very likely that any plans for a ground attack will be held in abeyance. I agree 100% on that score with Jack McQuethy, because the most important thing that's happened is a political thing now, and that is that the Soviets, who are a permanent member of the Security Council, are no longer on board supporting a ground war on behalf of all the objectives that the United States has in mind.
So let me go back to Brit Hume at the White House. Brit, whether or not the President objects to any one or any collection of the components, haven't we got a basic fact here that Saddam Hussein says he's prepared to quit?
We certainly do, Peter, but I would add one point to that. It is certainly one of the larger points that a lot of American bloodshed and certainly a lot of Iraqi bloodshed may now be able to be avoided. But there is what I think President Bush may regard as a still larger point. One of the reasons why he has been so insistent on a complete and unconditional withdrawal with no face-saving and no concessions is that this president sees this episode as the first test case, as the first example for the new world order he is trying to organize. Now, a lot of people think the whole idea is fanciful, and who knows, it may be. But he certainly believes in it, and he believes that the way all this comes out will be an object lesson for other dictators and other miscreants around the world.
Well,
so
Bert, let me ask you something I asked you. We were talking about on the telephone earlier today. If the White House thinks it needs to have Saddam Hussein's head on a plate, not to put too fine a point on it, do they think they can get it?
Well, I don't. If you mean by that, Peter, do they feel they can actually topple him or kill him or otherwise drive him out of power? The answer is there's not any certainty they can do that, although they wouldn't mind a bit if that happened. What they want to make sure happens is that he appears to have been humiliated, defeated, and disgraced in terms of this invasion of Kuwait, and that he be left in no position anytime soon or anytime ever to do such a thing again. And that's the lesson that this president seems very much to want the world to see.
Okay, let me go back to Jack McQuethy at the State Department, because don't we then, Jack, get into a question of interpretation depending who you are, in which country you live, as to whether or not he's been humiliated and whether or not, with such a considerable portion of his army destroyed already, he can cause enormous trouble in the future.
I think the Bush administration can argue, if they choose to, that Saddam Hussein has been humiliated, that he has been brought before the world, the general world court here, I suppose you could call it, and that he has been forced to withdraw from Kuwait under generally the conditions that the rest of the world has demanded. I think they can turn their whole argument around and say that tremendous damage has been inflicted upon Iraq, and that Saddam Hussein has failed miserably.
Okay, Jack McQuethy at the State Department and Brit Hume at the White House. Just to review, in case you've joined us, because it's a little after 7 o'clock Eastern Time, a little after 3 o'clock in the morning, Baghdad, where a meeting between Tariq Aziz, the Iraqi Foreign Minister, and Mr. Gorbachev, has just concluded within the last hour, so they went at it late until the night. There has been put forward a series of proposals by the Iraqis and the Soviets now, which call for, among other things, what Saddam Hussein is calling an unconditional withdrawal of his forces from Kuwait. Let's just call it a withdrawal of his forces from Kuwait, because other people see conditions that it should begin the second day after there is a ceasefire between the Allied coalition and Iraqi forces, and that over a staged period of time, prisoners of war should be released, economic sanctions should be dropped, all other economic sanctions against him, should I say all other United Nations sanctions against him should be dissolved, and that there should be an international force to monitor the withdrawal of Iraqi forces. And we have been having, or we've been listening together to something of an early debate on how the rest of the world, but particularly the Bush administration, might react. The Secretary of State, Mr. Baker, has just rushed over to the White House to see the President. Beg your pardon, he hasn't rushed, he's gone over to the White House to see the President, and we will be back to continue this in just a moment.
And now, the news